great thinker Confucius once mused the teaching that one cannot open a book without learning something. The idea highlights the importance of education, which can never be overemphasized here in China. Education is still considered for those with the humblest of background to rise to great heights. And in pursuing higher education, many Chinese go and study overseas, especially in the United States. In a recent trip here to China, a high-profile delegation of American college and university presidents were Chinese counterparts to try to enable more Chinese young talent to travel and study in America. So how did the trip go? And what can be done to further promote Sino-U.S. Education Exchange? Anyhow, you're listening to People in the Know, China's only English-language political current affairs program. Online at www.crienglish.com here on China Radio International. In this edition of our show, we'll talk about Sino-U.S. Education Exchange. So let's get started. U.S. Johns Hopkins University President William R. Brody was part of the 14-member delegation that recently made a visit to China and carried a message that the United States welcomes and values international students. He sat down with us to talk about the trip and bilateral education exchange. Mr. Brody, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to Beijing. It's a pleasure to have you here. Take us through what you're actually doing here in China as part of this overall tour.
Well, this is a bit of a historic tour because the U.S. Secretary of Education, Margaret Spellings, and the Assistant Secretary of State, Dina Powell, decided that it would be important to have a delegation of university presidents from America go abroad to China to talk about the importance of having Chinese students come to America to study, as well as American students studying in China. As far as I know, this is the first time ever that the U.S. government has taken a group of university presidents abroad on such a mission.
Oh, it's interesting. So the idea being obviously to cultural and exchanges, is that something that Johns Hopkins is actively doing, is trying to promote international students coming abroad?
Yes, and let me kind of backtrack a little bit. I think the backdrop for our trip was that post 9/11, as you know, the U.S. government tightened up restrictions on everybody coming in, and so getting visas was very difficult.
Right.
A number of university presidents began to have discussions with our government that this was really restricting the number of students that we really needed, and for both diplomacy as well as for economics and foreign relations, that this was important. And I think Secretary Rice and Secretary Spellings recognize the importance of this and have really worked very hard. This year we will have, I believe the State Department is issuing a record number of visas to Chinese students. So many of the problems that were seen 2 or 3 years ago with students trying to come to the States have been fixed. So part of our message was really to talk about the openness of the U.S. for students. As far as Johns Hopkins goes, we actually operate in 80 countries around the world in one form or another. We were the first research university started in the United States. Mm-hmm. And we actually have a campus in China, in Nanjing, and we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year.
Oh, great.
And we've opened the first jointly accredited master's degree program in the PRC.
Wow.
Well, we've had a long history. Ago, Johns Hopkins, with support with funding from the Rockefellers, started Peking Union Medical College, the first Western medical school in China.
Mm-hmm.
Many of those links were lost after World War II and the Revolution, but we're beginning to reestablish. In fact, we now have a joint doctoral program, PhD program in nursing with Peking Union Medical College.
Oh, excellent.
So we're very interested in building these kind of collaborations. We have campuses in Singapore and in Italy, and we find that these venues, although they're very hard to establish, that once they're established, they'd be an important part of accessing the rest of the world, letting the rest of the world access what we think Johns Hopkins, as well as providing a platform for our faculty and students abroad.
What's the talent pool like here in China comparatively when it comes to the students? I mean, is there growth, as it were, amongst the Chinese students as far as their educational standards are concerned?
Well, right now, if you look at U.S. graduate schools, I won't speak about undergrad, but in graduate schools, in PhD programs, in the sciences, probably across the U.S., about 60% of the students are from outside the U.S., and the bulk of those are from Asia. In China and India are either 1 and 2 or 2 and 1, depending on the school. So it's an incredible source of talent. There are about 2,000, I think, Chinese students. I may be off on the number, but it's a large number studying in the U.S. And with 1.3 billion people, the talent pool is phenomenal.
Yeah.
We are actually starting next year in Nanjing. We run a program in the United States called the Center for Talented Youth. This is a program that identifies very bright children age 11 to 13. And we provide a special curriculum during the year, online courses, and then during the summer they can go to one of 18 universities in the U.S. where we hold a special summer session with advanced courses for these students. We're going to open up a branch in Nanjing, I believe, next year.
Oh, great.
And it'll attract both international students who want to these bright kids whose parents want them to come to China to study and learn Chinese, but also we will take Chinese students who come.
Just getting back to the whole issue of student accessibility to these institutions, how much effort is being put in by individuals such as yourself to continue to lobby the U.S. administration and the Bush administration to try and loosen the restrictions even further?
Well, I think a lot is being put on, and I will say that with Secretary Spellings and Secretary Rice, as well as the Secretary of Homeland Security, this important part, I think, really are finding receptive voices. Whereas immediately post 9/11, the only issue was how do we prevent another terrorist attack. So I think they're very sympathetic, and I think you're going to see each year loosening of those restrictions. And I'm told now that 90+% of qualified students who apply for a visa are granted a visa in a relatively short time. But students do have to plan ahead. They do have to go in this case to the embassy or consulate to obtain the visa, but it is being done in a timely and efficient fashion, and I think that the State Department is putting a lot of emphasis on it.
One of the things that's always sort of an issue here in China is, of course, getting this government to issue travel visas to students who want to travel abroad as well. So in your capacity here during this trip, I mean, is that something that you work on as well to try and lobby the Chinese officials?
Well, the university presidents weren't involved in that, but Secretary Spellings did meet with the Premier of China, and I know they had a very productive, there is interest in that, and I think, clearly there are right now only, I think, about 4,000 or 5,000 U.S. students who are studying in China, and we would like to see that number increase. 20 years ago, when we started our campus in Nanjing, the Western students who come to Nanjing to study have to take courses in Mandarin. So there were not very many American students who were fluent in Mandarin.
Sure.
Today, there are many, many more, and in fact, in the U.S., there's a shortage of teachers of Chinese in public schools. So I think you're going to see a lot more American students wanting to come to China.
Oh, I see it right now. I mean, I've run into a bunch of expats all the time, who speak excellent Putonghua. It's really remarkable to see just how many people are actually out there learning the language. Talk about the funding for institutions such as yourself. I mean, obviously, international students for graduate courses bring in a lot of cash. I mean...
Well, let's kind of go back to the economics. Undergraduate education in the U.S. is relatively expensive. But there is a spectrum of institutions from state universities to private universities that have different levels of tuition and different levels of financial aid. So some universities offer financial aid for foreign students and some don't for undergraduates. So affordability at the undergraduate level is an issue. At the graduate level, particularly in the sciences, most students who come, American or foreign students, get a teaching or research assistantship which not only pays for their tuition but also pays them a monthly stipend to live on. So, in fact, having foreign students come doesn't generate money for us. What it does is generates knowledge. And it creates a form of diplomacy. And whether the students stay in the U.S. or go back to their host country, and many more, of course, are or will be going back to their host country, that link, we think, is very important for both economic as well as for diplomatic reasons.
You touched on the undergrad costs, and I mean it's something that I hear Chinese students complaining about.
It's an issue. It's an issue for two reasons. Because if an American student applies to Johns Hopkins, we provide a certain amount of financial aid, but there are also federal or state programs that can provide scholarships. or loans, and many of those are not, foreign students are not eligible. They're only made available to U.S. citizens. So it ties our hands in terms of what we can offer the students. That said, is an appreciation, particularly among the elite private universities that have high, about finding ways to provide more financial aid to bring in the foreign students.
I see. And lastly, before we let you run, is I want to ask you about institutional collaboration. I mean, is there a push on in the United States right now? I know there is here, particularly in China, with the schools here that really want to sort of link up with schools abroad as well. Is there a similar push going on in the U.S. as well?
Well, I think there are two pieces of that. Research is already globalized and already linked, and has been for a time, because when you're doing research, you want to collaborate with it. And if the world expert is in Thailand or China or Cambodia or France, let's say I'm working on earthquakes and I need somebody who's an expert in building materials that have particular properties, I may find that person in France or Belgium or Beijing. And I'm expert. So those collaborations already happen, and oftentimes universities don't even know they're happening. I got on a plane once and was going to Singapore, and as I was getting off, I was going from the United States. 3 of my faculty are getting off, and I asked them what they were doing, and they were all collaborating with some group in Singapore on a research project. So the research is already there. The educational collaborations are also building. They're harder to establish, in part because each country has regulations on education, which are not necessarily the same. So to create a joint master's degree program took us about 3 years to figure out how to make something that would work, that would be suitable for U.S. and Johns Hopkins institutions and for Chinese institutions. So the degree actually will have 2 Nanjing University and University at the bottom, so the students will have something that is of value for both countries. So those relationships take longer to develop. If you and I decide that we want our 2 institutions to collaborate, we can sign a piece of paper, but actually to implement it may take years.
Yeah, and that brings up one other interesting aspect too that I guess I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about, is academic accreditation. I mean, Chinese students here study at their own level and with their own institutions. How much effort has to be put into sort of combining or getting an academic standard out there?
Well, it's even a problem in the United States. The U.S. higher education system is incredibly decentralized and generally deregulated. And the question is, should the U.S. just forget whether we want to collaborate with China or any other country, or Canada for that matter? There's an issue in our country. If you go to a community college, can you transfer your credits to Johns Hopkins? How does all that work? And some universities will say they won't accept credits from McGill University in Canada or University of Toronto, but they will accept it from University of Vancouver. It makes it very hard on the students. So I think you're going to see over time more effort put in at standardization and credits, but it's a challenge.
Indeed. Well,